Amen.
And thank you, Jason, so much. Well, folks, again, I come to you very, very humbled, very honored that Bacon Heights would allow me to speak before you about these topics. I want to acknowledge I was very nervous last week, extremely, because I knew it was being recorded, and I thought, oh, well, I could say a lot of wrong things, and I get tongue-tangled a lot, and anyway, but that video, that class, as of yesterday, has been viewed 1.4 thousand times. Now, listen, I am well aware that it's not because of me. What this tells me is that there's great interest in this topic of being able to, this topic of Christian apologetics, of being able to have intelligent dialogue with friends and people who hold opposing worldviews, and then also use it to strengthen your own faith. Peter, an eyewitness of Jesus and one of the disciples. In fact, whenever the disciples are listed in Scripture, Peter's name is always listed first. And he was a smart man, but he was kind of a mess, wasn't he? But it was him in his first letter. Now, he was very impetuous, had serious anger issues. But spending enough time with Jesus later in his life, he wrote that first letter to Christians who had been disenfranchised, Christians who were under severe persecution under the current reign of the Emperor Nero at the time. And in that letter, in chapter 3, verse 15, he wrote, he said, "Always be ready to give a logical defense for your faith." And as I told you last week, that Greek word translated defense is the Greek word apologia, from which we get our English word apologetics. Apologetics meaning a defense. Christian apologetics meaning a defense of the Christian faith. And then he went on to say, but always do this with gentleness and respect. And so there is great interest, and I already knew this, among Christians to know how to give a logical defense of their faith. Again, tonight's topic is in response to those who would say that Jesus never existed. Now, how would you respond to that? Would you just say, yeah, the Bible says he did? Well, what if they don't have any regard for the Bible? Is there any historical evidence we can use to show them that he did exist? And then, additionally, we'll address the statement that the Bible cannot be trusted, but rather is a product of legend and corruption full of contradictions. Also, just to remind you, next week we will look at the centerpiece of Christianity, what some scholars call the epicenter. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, if Jesus has not been risen from the dead, then our preaching is futile, and so is your faith. And so next Wednesday night, I'll do my best to disprove the resurrection. And together, we'll see the best, most plausible explanation for the empty tomb is that Jesus did rise from the dead. It's a fascinating, fascinating journey. And then on the 20th, I'll come with you and I'll tell you about my own journey through what I call situational atheism. In the realm of depression, there are two types of depression. There's depression that we have every day. Your girlfriend dumps you, your boyfriend dumps you. You don't get into the college you want. You don't get someone pulled in front of you, whatever it is. We have the blues, the blahs, those bad days. That's called situational depression. But then there's an actual misfiring of the chemicals in someone's brain that causes what we call clinical depression or major depressive disorder. That's different. Situational depression is dependent on a single or multiple life experiences. And so I went through what I call situational atheism after I found my son that day after he'd taken his life. And I truly, for a while, tried to disprove God existed. I just couldn't believe that an all-loving God could allow such pain in this world. Of course, what I found was life-changing, and it was anything but that God didn't exist. But also on the September 20th, I'll give you some practical tools on how to talk to people who have worldviews that are opposed to the Christian faith. Well, it was Victor Borg, the pianist, the humorist, who said, the shortest distance between two people is humor. So I thought, hey, let's start off with some laughter, all right? Okay, so I want to see if this works. Oh, this is awesome. Now, ladies, do not mess with a man with a remote control in his hand. All right, I love this little cartoon. Mrs. Riley forgets to check the volume control and catches Pastor Smith off guard. You ever been in one of those? My first church was a country church, and I'll tell you what, this happened more than once. All right, then what I want to do is to give you my favorite 4 country music song titles that have yet to be, the songs have yet to be written, but these are great, great song titles. The first one, Her Teeth Was Stained, But Her Heart Was Pure. Second one, How Can I Miss You If You Won't Go Away? Now, Jim, I know that you're listening to this and you're thinking of some songs right now, some lyrics, aren't you? 2 more. I'm so miserable without you, it's like having you here. and of course, my favorite, the last one. You're the reason our kids are so ugly. All right, well, let's jump into this. I showed you this quote last week from C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis, I'll have a lot of quotes from him, but he is one of the greatest thinkers, one of the great thinkers, Christian and non-Christian, of the 20th century. Of course, he was an Oxford professor, former atheist going into Oxford. His testimony is contained in his book, Surprised by Joy. It's a very, very wonderful, wonderful testimony. But it was him who said, or he who said, Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. And as I reminded you last week, it was Dr. Jeremiah Johnston, one of the New Testament scholars at Houston Baptist University. For those who don't know, I've enrolled in the Masters of Apologetics program at Houston Baptist. It's a fantastic, rigorous degree. Dr. Johnston teaches there at Houston Baptist, and he has developed or created what's called the Christian Thinkers Society, and their purpose is teaching Christians to be thinkers and thinkers to be Christians. Most argument against Christianity from atheists and skeptics is that Christianity is an unintelligent faith, and we covered that last week, didn't we? As we cited scholar after scholar after scholar after very intelligent person after very intelligent person who is convinced that the Christian faith is true, not true only because of faith, but because of the evidence that supports it. Well, I want to quote another great theologian. His name is Dr. Seuss, and he said this, "You will miss the best things if you keep your eyes shut." And so I was helping my wife, Michelle, who's a school teacher at her school last Friday. Saw this up on the wall, and I thought, I'm going to use that next Wednesday. But that's true. A lot of people who don't believe in God simply don't want Him to exist. And so they won't take an honest look at the evidence. Well, in regard to thinking, being a Christian thinker, I like this as well. C.S. Lewis again. God is no fonder of intellectual slackers than of any other slackers. If you are thinking of being a Christian, he says, I warn you, you're embarking on something that is going to take the whole of you, brains and all. I once wrote an essay for one of my classes there at Houston Baptist, and in that essay I wrote these words. I said, a primary reason the historical study of Jesus is controversial is that a lot of information presented as truth is simply not true. It was Dr. Mike Licona, and I'll quote him. He was one of my professors. He is a brilliant historian and apologist. He is one of the scholars interviewed by Lee Strobel in Strobel's book, The Case for the Real Jesus. He once said, the only credentials somebody needs to post something on the internet is to be breathing. And that's about right, isn't it? So I went on in my essay and I said there's a vast difference between scholarly historical method and what someone heard from a non-Christian professor or read on the internet. Here's an example of what some people may believe. You see this on social media. The trouble with quotes on the internet is that you can never know if they're genuine. Abraham Lincoln. Now, I guarantee you, there was somebody who will run to somebody and go, I had no idea Abraham Lincoln said that. But it must be true because it's on the internet. Oh, so let's jump into this, shall we? I'll try not to break that 11th commandment, thou shalt not bore. Did Jesus exist? Now, obviously, we can look in our four Gospels, we can look at the prophecies in the Old Testament, but the four biographies, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, of course, are packed with the life, the birth, life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But what if we can't use the Bible? I was on Facebook. I had posted some sort of a devotional or blog. It was Christian related. One of my former students, and I was in youth ministry a long, long time, just like, not as long as Don, but a long time. And so all my students are grown up now. They're adults with children of their own. They live all over the country. I do most of their weddings, I think. But this former student of mine reposted that blog of mine. She had a friend who just railed on me in regard to Jesus. She said with authority, as far as her authority goes, there's no evidence that Jesus ever even existed. You'll hear that a lot. I was interested when I came across an article by a magazine called Salon. Now, this is a very liberal, hostile to Christianity site. And it says a growing number of scholars are openly questioning or actively arguing against Jesus' historicity. In other words, that he existed. Now, this would look very authoritative, right? Because it's on the internet. And it's a growing number of scholars. And so this would catch your attention. And so their first reason that they post is no first century scholar evidence. No first century secular evidence whatsoever exists to support the actuality of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, they quote Bart Ehrman, and we'll quote him a few times tonight. Ehrman, as I mentioned last week, is a professor of New Testament studies at the University of North Carolina. The guy is brilliant. I mean, he really is smart. But his research is just horrible. His arguments are so flawed. But in 2001, Salon magazine quotes this quote from Ehrman. Listen, I don't have it up on the screen. He said, what sorts of things do pagan authors from the time of Jesus have to say about him? And he says, nothing. As odd as it may seem, there's no mention of Jesus at all by any of the pagan contemporaries, non-Christian writers. There are no birth records, no trial transcripts, no death certificates. There are no expressions of interest, no heated slanders, no passing preferences, nothing. In fact, he says, if we broaden our field of concern to the years after Jesus' death, even if we include the entire first century of the Common Era, AD, there is not so much as a solitary reference to Jesus in any non-Christian, non-Jewish source of any kind. He said, I should stress that we do have a large number of documents from the time. The writings of poets, philosophers, historians, scientists, and government officials, for example. Not to mention the large collection of surviving inscriptions on stone and private letters and legal documents. In none of this vast array of surviving writings is Jesus' name ever so much as mentioned. Well, a funny thing happened between 2001 and 2012. Here's Dr. Bart Ehrman. Jesus existed. And those vocal persons who deny it do so not because they have considered the evidence with the dispassionate eye of the historian, but because they have some other agenda that this denial services. Now, Ehrman, I want you to understand, is a professed agnostic with atheistic leanings. This is the way he describes himself. He has a 300-page book entitled, Did Jesus Exist? I've read all 300 pages. He does not deny the existence of Jesus anymore. He goes after the fact, was Jesus God or not? Again, Ehrman continues, every week I receive 2 or 3 emails asking me whether Jesus existed as a human being. The reality is that whatever else you may think about Jesus, he certainly did exist. Now, this is someone who is hostile and oppositional to the Christian faith. The view that Jesus existed is held by virtually every expert on the planet. So you can see Ehrman woke up or had some sort of epiphany in those dozen or so years. Now, if you've ever been involved in religious discussion on Facebook or Twitter, you probably come across some version of the comment, I just think it's interesting that the only book that even talks about Jesus is the Bible. I'm not even sure we can prove he actually existed. So it's become this internet fad, trendy, to question the existence of Jesus, even though virtually every credible scholar on planet Earth agrees that he did. Is history knowable? The following that I'm about to read to you will apply to both questions, did Jesus exist and can the New Testament be trusted? Listen closely. Historians do not accept a historical testimony at face value. So when I quote these historians here in a little bit, understand they are not gullible, uneducated, backwoods people just willing to believe anything, as though Abraham Lincoln mentioned about the internet a few minutes ago. They're going to test and prove and scrutinize everything they possibly can. They're going to examine. And even like Dr. Licona, who I had as a professor and had many great personal conversations with, he tried to disprove the resurrection, but again, like any scholar who does honestly and openly, he couldn't do it. And what he found changed his life. Historians look for a variety of sources relaying the same information. The more sources they have pertaining to an event, the more certain the historian is that the event actually took place. The historian's job is much like that of a detective. A detective assesses a crime scene. How many of these crime shows are on today, both fictional and documentary? The detective looks for eyewitnesses. One person may have seen the crime from one angle, another may have seen the crime from another. The more eyewitnesses, the more certain the detective can be that the event took place in a particular fashion. The same is true for the historian. And this is why I often say, look, when we look for evidence for the existence of God, we must think less in the terms of a laboratory and more in the terms of a courtroom. Licona said, all ancient literature is given to us, handed down through the centuries by means of ancient texts and manuscripts of different sorts. This includes not only biblical texts, but non-biblical texts as well. Dr. Craig Blomberg, one of the authorities on the biblical texts, he's at Denver Seminary, he said none of the Greco-Roman historians, and scholars today agree that the biographies, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the biographies of Jesus, are in the form of ancient Greco-Roman biographies. And so you see other Greco-Roman biographies, the Gospels line up with the way those were written. He goes on, he says, none of the Greco-Roman historians of the first generations of the Christian era has much to say about the life of Jesus, but several important passages provide brief, independent testimony to Jesus' existence. So why don't we get into some of those examples? Josephus lived in the first century. He was a Jewish historian. He wrote his massive work called the Antiquities of the Jews. He records in there around AD 37, he says, at this time there was a wise man named Jesus. Now this is 20 centuries old. His conduct was good and he was known to be virtuous. In recounting the stoning of James, James is the half-brother of Jesus. James was a skeptic, a non-believer until after the resurrection. In fact, we know in the Gospels that all of Jesus' family thought Jesus was 100% USDA nuts. Some even called him possessed by a demon. They called him a drunk. They called him all kinds of things. It was the famous saying from one of the skeptics, can anything good come out of Nazareth? So James was actually martyred for his faith. Josephus records, "So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." Again, these are historical, ancient records mentioning this very person who some on the internet say there's no historical evidence for. Celsus was a 2nd century Greek philosopher and a fierce opponent of Christianity. In what is known to be the first comprehensive intellectual attack on Christianity, he tried to resolve why Jesus was able to perform miracles. And we'll get into this later. It's called enemy attestation. In other words, they can't explain what he did. They just try to give their own reasons, but they can't resolve it. So the story is wild, but the main point is that by trying to explain away the miracles of Jesus, he actually is affirming that they happened. He writes this, 2nd century. "Jesus, on account of his poverty, was hired out to go to Egypt. While there, he acquired certain powers which Egyptians pride themselves on possessing. He returned home highly elated at possessing these powers, and on the strength of them gave himself out to be a god." Jesus was never, because of his poverty, hired out to go to Egypt. What Celsus is doing is simply attacking Jesus, in court, where, you got Slayton over here. You know this. When the evidence is against you, what do? You attack the witness. And so the evidence is against these ancient writers in that Jesus not only existed, but that he had powers of some kind. So what do? They attack him and they warp and twist the facts. This fact comes to us from one of the most trusted historians of the ancient world. Cornelius Tacitus is the pinnacle historian of Roman antiquity. He was born in AD 56, served as a respected senator and proconsul of Asia under Emperor Vespasian. He wrote a history of the 1st century empire, which many historians consider to be the pinnacle of Roman historical writing. He writes this, "Christus, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of the procurators, Pontius Pilate." So now we have a Roman historian who had no regard for Jesus whatsoever, actually mentioned Jesus in his historical record, which is fascinating in and of itself, because when you consider that Jesus never traveled outside of Palestine, Galilee, this area, really, at its face value, he was not overly popular. He like I said, he didn't travel outside that time. He never wrote any books. It's an amazing thing that he would get any publicity whatsoever in these writings. So now we know he not only existed, but that he was condemned to die under Pontius Pilate. Josephus, again, a Jew. Now you may say, well, at least he was Jewish and Jesus was Jewish, so they liked each other. No, you remember the Jews are responsible for killing Jesus. Josephus confirmed, Pilate condemned Jesus to be crucified and to die. Josephus continues, and many people from among the Jews and the other nations became Christ's disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. Pliny the Younger lived in AD 61 to 113 and was an influential lawyer and magistrate of ancient Rome. In a letter to Emperor Trajan, he wrote, "They, Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light." This is after the resurrection, so now they're meeting on Resurrection Day or Sunday, which is why we meet on Sunday today. And they sang an alternate verse, a hymn to Christ as to a God, and bound themselves to a solemn oath, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word or deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. And so the record from antiquity goes on and on and on. I could read you more, but let's move on. Let's look at some more recent atheistic historians and philosophers. Gerd Ludemann, German New Testament historian, professor of the University of Göttingen and a member of the Chair of History and Literature of Early Christianity. He believes Jesus existed and says Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. John Donovan McCrossan, an Irish New Testament professor and historian, he teaches Jesus existed, but that he wasn't the Son of God. He said, quote, that he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be, since both Josephus and Tacitus agree. Let me read you one more quote by Bart Ehrman. He said, this is not an issue for scholars any longer. There is no scholar in any college or university who teaches classics, ancient history, or New Testament, early Christianity, who doubts that Jesus existed. He is abundantly attested in early sources. Early and independent sources indicate that Jesus certainly existed. Paul is an eyewitness to both Jesus' disciple Peter. Catch that. He's also acknowledging Paul existed. Paul is an eyewitness to both Jesus' disciple Peter and the brother of Jesus. He says, I'm sorry. Atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism because it makes you look foolish to the outside world. He concludes, whether we like it or not, Jesus certainly existed. Dr. Johnston, the professor I mentioned, New Testament scholar down at Houston Baptist, he said this. He said, there is more evidence that Jesus of Nazareth lived than for the most famous figures of the first century. So this goes on and on and on. So we move on. So that's settled. Jesus lived. And some of you, or most of you, are probably saying, well, good, I already knew that. But again, there may be some who maybe were on the edge, maybe needed some more evidence. And now for you Christians, when you do see those internet memes, or you see someone just spout off, like I did on Facebook that day, Jesus never existed, there's no evidence. Just like me, you'll be able to say very calmly and kindly, actually, there is much evidence, historical ancient evidence, that Jesus did live. Boy, that person I said that to, they did not like that at all. So let's focus on the New Testament. We're saying, can we trust the Bible? Let's focus that on the New Testament. Okay, so you have a Bible. I know you do, either here or at home. At least you have a digital version, maybe on your phone or your tablet. Bruce Metzger said this. Lee Strobel interviewed Bruce Metzger. He is one of the foremost authorities on the New Testament documents. Metzger said this to Strobel. He said, when I hold the Bible in my hands, essentially I'm holding copies of ancient historical records. Did you know that? The originals are gone. He goes on to say, the original manuscripts of the biographies of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and all other books of the Old New Testament have long ago crumbled into dust. We don't have them. So how can I be sure these modern-day versions bear any resemblance to what the authors originally wrote? Well, you'll hear that from skeptics all the time. What they actually wrote on was papyrus, and it crumbled. It didn't last long. Well, let me start off by quoting another professor from Houston Baptist University. This is Dr. Holly Ordway. She is extremely intelligent. She is dean of the School of Apologetics of Christian Thought there at Houston Baptist University. She wrote a book, a biography, an autobiography of her own journey from hostile atheism to Christianity. I have that book in my office. I've read it as well. She tells her story. She begins, quote, I'd never in my life said a prayer, never been to a church service. In college, I absorbed the idea that Christianity was historical, or maybe hysterical, curiosity, or a blemish on modern civilization, or perhaps both. My college science classes presented Christians as illiterate, anti-intellectuals who, because they didn't embrace Darwinism, threatened the advancement of knowledge. At 31 years old, I was an atheist college professor, and I delighted in thinking of myself that way. I got a kick out of being an unbeliever. It was fun to consider myself superior to the unenlightened, superstitious masses and to make snide comments about Christians. Hooray for Dr. Ordway. I mean, she's brutally honest here. And if atheists and skeptics who are hostile to Christianity would be honest, they would admit that they're the same way. So, she says, there was something about the idea of faith that made it stick with me. I didn't have faith. I didn't want faith, but I felt compelled to have a good reason why not. In other words, she was intellectually honest enough to say, I don't like it. I don't believe it. I think it's ridiculous and laughable. But that's not going to hold up in court. I need a good reason why I don't believe. She said, I constructed an elaborate analogy for myself, one that I felt gave satisfying explanation of why faith was impossible. I could not believe, no matter how much I might want to. I thought faith was a meaningless word, that so-called believers were either hypocrites or self-deluded fools, and that it was a waste of time. I didn't want to deal with that. Easier by far to read only books by atheists that told me what I wanted to hear, that I was smarter and more intellectually honest and more superior than the poor, deluded Christians. She says, quite honestly, I had built myself a fortress of atheism. Now, in 2 weeks, we're going to talk about these very folks who have built around them a fortress of atheism. Because when you get beyond those walls, you know what you find? People just like you and me, who somewhere along the way either got hurt or maybe they had their own experience of situational atheism and never were able to move beyond it. But they all have questions. And there are very gentle and respectful ways to engage in dialogue with these very precious people and to perhaps even help discover what that wall around them is made of and what created it. So, both Ordway and C.S. Lewis were credentialed professors of literature before becoming Christians. Both were committed atheists who had created intellectual defenses. So, Dr. Ordway, in regard to the Gospels, the credibility of the Gospels, she said this: I read through the Gospel narratives again, trying to take in what they said. I had to admit that, even apart from everything else I had learned, I recognized that they were fact, not story, not legend, not fantasy, not a fairy tale. I'd been steeped in folklore. I mean, this is her PhD work. Fantasy, legend, and myth ever since I was a child, and I had studied these literary genres as an adult. I knew their cadences, their flavor, their rhythm. None of these stylistic fingerprints appeared in the New Testament books that I was reading. So there we have a trained, experienced atheist professor, former atheist professor of literature, who, if anything, knows a myth when she sees it. And she says these are not myths. So I want to move on to some real practical things very quickly. Number one, the purity of the text. What do I mean by the purity of the text of the New Testament? In other words, how close are our known manuscripts to the wording of the original autographs? For instance, I just told you, the originals, the things that Matthew wrote, the things that Mark wrote, Luke, John, Peter, Paul, James, they're all gone. And just like other ancient literature, Homer's Iliad, all these originals, they're gone. And so over time, copies were made, or what we call manuscripts. What helps to know if the originals are accurate is the date, the amount of time we have between the original and the first copy made. Makes sense, right? So what evidence do we have for all ancient texts? Because all ancient literature is given to us, it's handed down by the centuries by means of these ancient texts. The most responsible manner in which to investigate the purity of the New Testament text is by comparing its purity with the purity of all other ancient texts. And so when we look at the Bible and study the manuscripts and how they relate in a gap of time, we need to compare that to non-biblical texts, right? Let me see how it stacks up. By using the same investigative methods and on non-biblical ancient literature, we gain an accurate, responsible understanding of how pure or impure they are. So we go back to Dr. Bruce Metzger, one of the great, most foremost authorities on the biblical texts. He says the absence of originals, the original autographs, what they call them, is not unique to the Bible. It's a question we can ask of other documents handed down to us from antiquity. But what the New Testament has in its favor, especially compared to other ancient writings, is the unprecedented multiplicity of copies that have survived. The more copies you have that agree with each other, especially if they emerge from different geographical areas, and we'll get that in a minute, man. Start your engines. The more you can cross-check them to figure out what the original document was like. So how does the New Testament compare to other ancient literature? Well, let's look at Homer's epics. Now, this is not Homer Simpson, all right? All right? This is the ancient writer, Homer. Oh, man. Okay, so his Iliad and other writings, there are presently nearly 2,000 manuscripts, copies of Homer's original writings. The period of time between the oldest manuscript to the original is around 350 years. So let's just use that as a standard. How about that? So we have Homer. He wrote his original epics. The first copy acknowledged by historians as accurate, as credible, about a 350-year gap. Plutarch wrote a series of biographies, some 50 to 60 biographies. Today, we have about 48. I know it numbers in the dozens, written beginning in the 2nd century. The oldest manuscript in existence is dated in the 10th century and is not even a complete manuscript. So the gap between Plutarch's biographies, what's called Plutarch's Lives, and the earliest manuscript regarded to be accurate by historians is 800 years. Okay, so you have Homer, autographs to manuscripts 350 years, and then you have Plutarch, autographs to manuscript about 800 years. Well, how does that compare to the New Testament manuscripts? Well, I've got good news. As of September 2013, the number of Greek manuscripts of the New Testament is 5,838. This is an increase of 500 discovered manuscripts since the 80s, 1980s. God just continues to allow mankind to discover His Word and to show that, listen, God, just as we are, is not interested in blind faith. He is speaking to us through this historical ancient evidence. On a second level of importance, we have another 25,000 manuscripts of the New Testament in other languages: Syriac, Latin, the Latin Vulgate that Jerome wrote, Coptic, etc. On a third level of importance, we have over 1 million New Testament quotations from the early church fathers. The average size of a Greek manuscript of the New Testament is 459 pages. Folks, there are well over 25,000 extant or existing manuscripts of our New Testament, which is insurmountable evidence compared to other ancient works like Homer and Plutarch. So you're able to say that now to a skeptic. If someone says there's no real evidence for the biblical text, you can say, well, let's talk about how we investigate other ancient texts. You can bring up Homer and Plutarch. Presently, this is fascinating. The earliest manuscript available is what's called the John Rylands P52 manuscript. It's called the Rylands manuscript because it is right now displayed in the Rylands Museum in London. It's a manuscript of the Gospel of John. Look at that. It's no bigger than a credit card, and it has a Greek inscription on the front and back of it. Scholars date this manuscript to as early as 10 to 60 years from when John originally wrote his gospel. Scholars place the writing of the Gospel of John around 90 AD, and this is believed by the majority of scholars, both Christian and non-Christian alike. And so we're talking about a manuscript, regardless of how small it is, of somewhere between 10 and 60 years. In historical circles, regarding historical method used by all types of ancient literature, this is absolutely a gold mind. Sir Frederick Kenyon was a former director of the British Museum and author of the Paleography of Greek Papyri. He said, "In no other case is the interval of time between the composition of the book and the date of the earliest manuscripts so short as in that of the New Testament. The last foundation for any doubt that the Scriptures have come down to us substantially as they were written has now been removed." So comparing apples to apples, in other words, ancient literature to ancient literature, there is no comparison. Listen, as a Christian, I know you believe by faith. I do believe by faith also. But as I studied this, it was like I was saying to God, I knew I was right. I knew it. I knew it. Because it's okay to doubt. John the Baptist doubted. There's a fascinating passage in Matthew 28 where it says, and Jesus rose, he ascended to heaven. And then it said, Matthew records, and some of them doubted. Holy cow, what kind of evidence do you need? The guy starts floating up to the clouds? That would convince me. And so what I'm saying is, it's okay to doubt. Doubt is a parasite of faith. There are times when we have questions, but we need to be able to dialogue about those questions. Parents, grandparents, don't hesitate to visit with your kids, your grandkids, your siblings, whoever it is, your friends at work or wherever. It's a fascinating thing. Oh, there's more here I could say, but we need to move on. Oh, this is good. Let's talk about authorial bias for a minute, because this is another huge argument that Bart Ehrman uses. And I use Ehrman because he's one of the heroes of the non-Christian demographic. He's written lots of very trendy New York Times bestsellers, misquoting Jesus, did Jesus exist, things like this, to cast as much doubt on the person of Jesus as he possibly can. And just like Salon Magazine did earlier when I quoted that article, when skeptics or atheists argue against Christianity, many times they'll quote Ehrman because he's very smart, he's a historian, but so what he'll do sometimes is he'll say, we don't even know who wrote the Gospels. That's actually true. But we don't have the originals. You'll notice in your Bible, nowhere does it say, Matthew wrote this Gospel, Mark wrote this Gospel, Luke wrote this, John wrote this. And we don't have the originals. You see, Ehrman and people like him also can't prove that they didn't write them. Because perhaps on the originals, it did say, I, Matthew, wrote this. I, Mark, wrote this. So keep that in mind. So how do we know that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John wrote these? Well, it was passed down. We have Papias, and then Mercian, and then Justin Martyr. All of these within the first 50 years of the 2nd century, all attributed these Gospels. They attributed Matthew to Matthew, Mark to Mark, Luke to Luke, and John to John. These come within the first half of the 2nd century. But let's talk about this bias thing for a minute. Everyone has bias, right? Everybody does. Ehrman says this. He claims that when John, the gospel, John the disciple, he said when he writes, these words are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That's from John 20. Ehrman says, well, John's not being honest because he wants you to believe in Jesus. Well, in response, Dr. Licona was actually debating Ehrman, and he said this. He quoted Gerd Ludemann, who is the atheist New Testament scholar from Germany. In Ludemann's 2004 book, The Resurrection of Christ, he writes, quote, my book's aim was to prove the non-historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. Sound like bias to you? Richard Dawkins, mentioned him last week. In his book, The God Delusion, New York Times bestseller, here's what Dawkins writes in the beginning, in the introduction. If this book works as I intend, religious leaders who open it will be atheists when they put it down. Sound like bias to you? Sounds like bias to me. And Licona says, so do Ludemann and Dawkins possess bias and agenda? Sure. Should we throw out their books because of this? Licona says no. We throw out their books because their arguments are bad. So we all have bias, right? And it's not simply a religious issue, is it? You remember 2 years ago, Dallas Cowboys, Green Bay Packers, playoff game. the catch, the non-catch, Des Bryant. If you're an NFL football fan, you remember that. Well, how do we know if Des Bryant caught that pass or not? It cost the Cowboys from going to the next level of the playoffs. Well, probably your decision is based on bias, depending on which team you're rooting for. So it applies in all aspects of life. Let's talk about contradictions just for a minute. I'll never forget it. I worked at Abilene National Bank, working my way through college there in Hardin-Simmons in Abilene. And I'm standing next to a guy, and I know he's a Christian, or he said he was, but all of a sudden he started talking about the Bible, and he said, man, the Bible is just full of contradictions. I was 19, 18. I'd never heard of that before. No one had ever talked to me about it. I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't say anything. I'm just sitting there, man, putting those deposit slips in those tubes, letting them fly out to the cars out there in the drive-thru. One day I sent out $500 to the wrong person. They rode off with it. I'll tell you about that another time. But I've mentioned Dr. Licona a few times. Here's a 4-minute video. He is in the midst of a conference, and he's talking about a number of things. But in this short video clip, he talks about contradiction. And he has an entire book on the perceived contradictions in Scripture. Listen to what he says.
Contradictions. Ehrman says that the Gospels contradict themselves, and so therefore they shouldn't be believed. In our debate, which was on the resurrection of Jesus, he says, look, we just can't trust them. They can't even agree amongst each other. Was Jesus crucified at 9 a.m. or at noon? Depends which gospel you read, he says. Did Jesus carry his cross all the way as John portrays, or did Simon of Cyrene help him as Matthew, Mark, and Luke portrays? It depends which gospel you read. When Jesus is crucified between two thieves, did both thieves curse him as Mark portrays? Or did one thief say to Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom, as Luke says? Depends which one you read. And when Jesus is raised from the dead and the women come to the tomb, how many angels were there? Was there one, like Matthew and Mark say, or were there two, like Luke and John say? Depends which one you read. And how many women went to the tomb? Was there just one, like John says, or were there multiple women, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke say? Depends which one you read. And did Jesus first appear to his disciples in Jerusalem, like Luke says, or was it in Galilee, like Matthew says? And did he appear on Easter, and all the appearances occur on Easter, and he rose, and then he ascends into heaven on Easter, like Luke says, or did it happen over a period of time, like the rest of the Gospels portray? Now, some of you are thinking right now, oh my gosh, no wonder he doesn't believe. I didn't know all those things existed, all those differences. Look, I didn't either. I really didn't pay much attention to them. And then I started doing my doctoral research, and I decided one thing I needed to do was read through the burial and resurrection narratives in the Gospels 35 times in Greek. And that way it would really slow me down and concentrate on every single word and phrase that was used so I could read these carefully. And as I was doing that, I found a lot of differences. So what about these?
Excellent. Now, while Ehrman attacks the Gospels, and that's what Dr. Licona is responding to there, he tries to give examples of contradictions in non-biblical sources of antiquity as well. But Licona responds with this. He says, let's look at examples of writings of that same period of time and see if there are also these contradictions. And I'll get to those contradictions in a minute, because they're not contradictions, they're simply differences. Licona says, the burning of Rome in AD 64, July. There are three primary resources, Suetonius, Tacitus, and Dio Cassius. Neither were eyewitnesses. None of them. And they all contradict one another on various details. So some of the details are different, but one thing's for sure, Rome burned to the, Rome burned to the ground. Multiple independent attestation. Licona's example, let me skip that. When reading ancient literature and we stumble across a seeming contradiction, it's important to ask, is it a contradiction or a difference? A contradiction is when two events are incompatible. A difference is when the information may be different, but per closer investigation, one discovers the events are compatible and resolvable. Differences are a common thing that occur in the reporting of history. Suggesting the writing of someone's biography. Oh, never mind. Forget that. Let me illustrate differences and contradictions. Let's say that Michelle and I, on a given night of the week, have kind of nights out, she with the girls, me with the guys. All right? So we come home later that evening, and we say, hey man, how'd your evening go? Here's Michelle. Oh my goodness, it was incredible. I had water, she had ginger ale, she had a margarita, I sipped off of hers, and then I went home there, I had nachos, and then we talked about all sorts of things. We talked about our jobs, and then our families, and it goes on and on and on and on. How'd your night go? It was great. You know what? There are different, just because we don't share specific things within our story doesn't mean that it doesn't have substance. Interesting. You pick up these authors, biographers of antiquity are really no different than the biographers of today. They recorded things that were important to them, and that's one of the geniuses of God providing 4 accounts of Jesus' life. You have it from 4 different angles. Some things are included here, not there. Interesting, you pick up a copy of Ronald Reagan's autobiography, and maybe, man, you want some juiciness. You want to hear stuff about his first marriage. You know how much about his first marriage is written in his autobiography? 3 sentences. You have to go somewhere else for that. So Ehrman points out all these seeming contradictions. There were 2 angels recorded by this gospel writer, 1 here. Mary's first to the tomb here. She's not first to the tomb here, so forth and so on. Jesus carried his cross here. Simon of Cyrene helped him here, and so on. Let me address these real quickly. When John leaves out the fact that Simon of Cyrene helped Jesus carry his cross, it doesn't mean John is contradicting the other Gospels. John did not say Jesus alone carried his cross. He just didn't mention Simon of Cyrene. The thieves on the crosses next to Jesus, did both mock Jesus or did one repent? Both mocked Jesus and one repented. No gospel writer says that both mocked him and neither of them repented. It's simple logic. John said Mary went to the tomb, while the other gospel writers say that there were multiple women. But John never writes that just Mary went to the tomb. It amazes me that Ehrman or any other scholar would even make this. It just shows you how cheap a shot Satan will take to create doubt in the mind of someone. And isn't doubt his MO? Remember in the garden in Genesis chapter 3, where it oddly sounds like chapter 3, verse 1, picks up in mid-conversation between the serpent and Eve. And do you remember what the serpent, Satan, did? He said, did God really say? In other words, he's letting Eve have, God did say something, but did he really say that whole thing of doubt? Well, let's jump ahead, Lord knows how long, eons and eons until the 1st century. And there we have Matthew and Luke's account, both chapter 4 of what's called the showdown in the desert, when Jesus is led by the Spirit to be tempted by Satan. Remember what Satan did? Remember his words? He comes up, he says, if you are the Son of God. Man, that has been his strategy from day one. He'll give a little, but he's going to make sure that you doubt the truth. I could go on and on and on, these seeming contradictions. There's no reason to. They all are resolvable. I'm sorry, they are not contradictions. And now if I could go back 30 years, 20, I don't know how long ago that was, and stand in that bank with that guy next to me, I'd be able to say, oh my goodness, there are no contradictions in Scripture, no contradiction in the Gospels. There are differences. There are accounts given from multiple angles. They're all resolvable. Let's look at them together. Look what Lacona says. He says, we don't report like that today. In other words, some people will look at the ancient biographies of Jesus and go, well, we don't report like that today. How come? He says, so what? It's our responsibility today not to judge the gospel writers because they didn't write according to 21st century idiom. We, as responsible students of history, have to go back to the first century and discover and learn what the idioms were of that day. It takes a little work, a little investigation. That's why it's so easy to get on the internet and say, the Bible's not trustworthy. Post, Jesus didn't exist. Post, I'm an authority. Listen, anybody can do that. Like Laconia said, the only credential we need is to be breathing. So he goes on, and he says, and how they could write as biographers of that day and judge them according to the literary conventions of that day, not our day. C.S. Lewis, to sort of bookend this thing, Holly Ordway said the same thing, but Lewis said it back in the mid-20th century. He says, as a literary historian, now remember, Lewis is a former ardent atheist. He was a brilliant human being. He said, as a literary historian, I am perfectly convinced that whatever else the Gospels are, they are not legends. I've read a great deal of legend, and I'm quite clear that they are not the same sort of thing. They are not artistic enough to be legends. From an imaginative point of view, they are clumsy. They don't work up to things properly. Most of the life of Jesus is totally unknown to us, as is the life of anyone else who lived at that time. And no people building up a legend would have allowed that to be so. Simon Greenleaf, and we'll refer to him next week, he was the eminent professor of law at Harvard Law School. He said there's enough of a discrepancy in the Gospels to show that there could have been no previous concert among them. In other words, let's say you have 4 witnesses to a crime, and they parrot each other. They say exactly, there's no variance whatsoever. Well, what's happened? They're all making it up. They've memorized each other's story. And so logic tells you that there will be differences of viewpoint, of opinion in that way. So he goes on. And at the same time, such substantial agreement as to show that they were all independent narrators of the same great transaction. Last thing. Oh, and I like this, the adverse witness test. Check this out. Strobel interviewing Craig Blomberg again in his book, Case for Christ. Blomberg says, or Strobel says this. He goes, many people have reasons, or had had reasons, for wanting to discredit the Christian faith and would have done so if they could have simply told history better. Or Blomberg said that. He said, yet look at what Jesus' opponents did say. In later Jewish writings, Jesus is called a sorcerer who led Israel astray. It says that in the Babylonian Talmud, which is a Jewish historical narrative expanding on the history of the Jews. The Jews, not all, but majority, hated Jesus. That they even mentioned him in their historical writings says a lot. But then they could not explain away his magic, his miracles. They simply called him a sorcerer. And of course, that's what they attribute in the Gospels. They said, you do this by the power of Beelzebub, and so forth and so on. Enemy attestation. He goes on, he says, this would have been a perfect opportunity to say something like, the Christians will tell you he worked miracles, but we're all here to say he didn't. Yet, that's the one thing we never see Jesus' opponents saying. Instead, they implicitly acknowledge that what the Gospels wrote, that Jesus performed miracles, is true. Strobel asks, could this Christian movement have been taken root right there in Jerusalem, in the very area where Jesus had done much of his ministry, crucified, buried, and resurrected, if people who knew him were aware the disciples were exaggerating and lying? Blomberg said, absolutely not. He said, we have a picture of what was initially a very vulnerable and fragile movement that was being subjected to persecution. If critics could have attacked it on the basis that it was full of falsehoods or distortions, they would have. He said, but that's exactly what we do not see. There's an interesting passage in 1 Corinthians 15. Paul said, for I delivered to you of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. If this didn't happen, any of those people could have come forward and said, hey, Paul, you're nuts. This didn't happen. Any of the contemporaries of the gospel writers could have come forward and said, you guys are nuts. Folks, we do not have anything in existence, ancient or modern, well, modern we may, but ancient, from contemporaries of this time that record anything to deny that these things happen. They try to explain it away, but they can't deny it. Let's conclude with this. William Sangster said this about the Bible. He said, the tooth of time gnaws all books but the Bible. 19 centuries of experience have tested it. It's passed through the critical fires no other volume has suffered. And its spiritual truths have endured the flames and come out without so much as the smell of burning. Joseph Smith claims to have received a message from an angel, and thus the Book of Mormon came to be. I was looking over at this ladder here, and it occurred to me, what is that doing here? And then I remembered, oh, we must have been hosting the Latter-day Saints. Oh, I'd like to edit that out of the video. Okay, but Smith's claims, he founded Mormonism, are suspect for at least two reasons. First, the Book of Mormon has been shown to be hopelessly untrustworthy at every point of its history. Not a single geographical site has been discovered. Oh, I didn't even have time to go over the geographical evidence for the support of the Scriptures. Second, there are no other prophets who claim to have a revelation that was consistent with Smith's. The Book of Mormon has but one author whose personal character is suspect, and there is no corroborating authorship in existence subjected to the same kind of evaluation. Muhammad, the author of the Quran, would fare no better. In contrast, the Bible was written over a 1,500-year span, written over 40 generations, written by more than 40 authors from every walk of life, including kings, peasants, philosophers, fishermen, poets, statesmen, and scholars. Moses was a political leader, Peter a fisherman, Amos a herdsman, Joshua a military general, Nehemiah a cupbearer, Daniel a prime minister, Luke a doctor, Solomon a king, Matthew a tax collector, and Paul a rabbi. It was written in different places. Moses in the wilderness, Jeremiah in a dungeon, Daniel on a hillside and in a palace, Paul inside prison walls, Luke while traveling, John on the Isle of Patmos, and others in the rigors of military campaign. It was written at different times. David in times of war, Solomon in times of peace, written during different moods, some writing from the heights of joy, others from the depths of sorrow and despair. Written on 3 different continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe. Written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Written in many different literary types, history, law, religious poetry, didactic treatises, lyric poetry, parables, allegory, biography, so on. Finally, its subject matter includes hundreds of controversial topics, yet the biblical authors spoke with harmony and continuity from Genesis to Revelation, and above all, there is one single unfolding story, God's redemption of mankind. Edwin Lutzer is the pastor of Moody Bible Church in Chicago. He's an author, he's a theologian. He said Voltaire, the 18th century philosopher, very hostile toward Christianity. Voltaire said that in a generation of his life, the Bible would be outdated. But after his death, his house was purchased by the Geneva Bible Society to spread Bibles throughout Europe. The Bible has been pronounced dead over and over again, but the corpse never stays put. C.S. Lewis said, at the present, we're on the outside of heaven, the wrong side of the door. But all the leaves of the New Testament are wrestling with the rumor that it will not always be so. The reason for that is because 20 centuries ago, outside of Jerusalem, there was an execution. And 3 days later, something happened that split history in two, BC and AD. the tomb was empty and the resurrection had happened. But that's next week. I hope you'll come back and join me. I hope this has made some sense. Let's pray together. Well, Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for the opportunity to come together and just be reminded, Lord, that the Bible's true. God, we would know that by faith and we would confess it by faith, but Lord, thank you for helping us see that even secular ancient evidence bears witness to this fact. God, again, as I did last week, pray for anybody, Lord, here who's struggling with doubt, who may be skeptical, that, Lord, you'd make their hearts soft and you'd let them know how much you love them. And then, God, again, we pray for the people on the Texas coast who will for many, many months and years, Lord, be struggling to put their lives back together. And we ask you, God, to give them hope and to give them peace. Remind them, Lord, that though weeping may last for the night, that joy does come in the morning. We love you, and we pray this in the name of Jesus on the authority of his shed blood. And all God's people said, amen. Thanks for coming.